Greetings, my name's Peter Sherlock. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Divinity based in Melbourne, Australia, and it's my delight to welcome you to this conversation, part of the university's series on COVID revelations, exploring what's been disclosed, what we can discern and what our duty might be in the midst of the current coronavirus pandemic engulfing the world in 2020. For tonight's conversation, our theme is Plague, Pestilence and Pandemic, faith-based responses from scripture and history. And we have a panel of 4 experts drawn from around the globe that I'm delighted to introduce to you. We have Karen Jillings, who is Senior Lecturer in History at Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We have Monica Melanchthon, the Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible from Pilgrim Theological College in the University of Divinity. And also from Pilgrim Theological College, Robyn Whitaker, Senior Lecturer in New Testament. And from the University of Oxford, Lyndal, who is the Regius Professor of History there. So welcome all of you. I thought for tonight's conversation, we might start out with moving from the earliest to the latest, if you like, in thinking about faith-based responses to plague, pandemic and pestilence. And so, Monica, I wonder if you might start us off with some thoughts about what does the Hebrew Bible in particular have to say about disease and pestilence?
Okay. I started off with the question how the Hebrew Bible might shape our reflections and responses to the COVID crisis. And I think for those of us who believe that the canon is a legitimate source of guidance in our present times, it is important that we know more accurately what the Hebrew Bible says. I say this particularly because in Australia there is a tendency to marginalize the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible, as most of us will know, says a lot about sickness and illness of the body. And there are a number of Hebrew words that pertain to illness and disease. But for our purposes this evening, it is significant to recall the fact that the dominant assumption of the Hebrew Bible is that the God Yahweh is in control of every aspect of the universe, and it is therefore unsurprising that Yahweh is described as directly responsible for initiating illnesses or diseases. And often the disease is depicted as divine punishment. And there are many, many texts that attest to this. And the reasons for this divine punishment could be infringement of God's commandments, for disobedience, a failure to carry out God's commands, or for being rebellious, as in the case of Miriam in Numbers chapter 12. So you will find that inflicting illness as punishment is a recurring theme, not just on the Israelites, but also on non-Israelites. In preparing for this evening, I came across a very curious text that you will find in 1 Samuel chapters 5 and 6. And I do not know if I can lead you in a Bible study of sorts, but the text talks about the fact, the text is part of the Ark narrative. And the Israelites decide to take the Ark into the battlefield against the Philistines. And the Philistines are now, wondering if they were going to lose the battle, but decide to fight courageously. And the Israelites lose, and many Israelites die. So the Philistines take the Ark and capture the Ark and take it to the temple of the temple of their chief god in Ashdod. Anyway, to cut a long story short, you find all through chapter 5 a description of the fact that Philistines were dying from a mysterious illness, which has been described as tumors, as hemorrhoids, or as swelling in the secret parts in one old translation. And so they decide then, upon the advice of their priests, to pass the Ark back to the Israelites. So the Ark is brought back to the Israelites in a cart a wooden cart drawn by 2 cows, and it included also some propitiatory offerings, which was images made of the tumors in gold, and also rats or mice. Now, what is interesting is that upon reaching Beth Shemesh, which is the city closest to Ekron, belonging to the Philistines, the Israelites receive the ark with much rejoicing, and then proceed directly to observe certain rituals, and that is the burning of the cart and the burning of the cows. And then this is followed by a very few verses where we are told that in Beth Shemesh about 70 men died because they looked into the ark. But that particular part of the narrative does not describe the symptoms. So in other words, we are told that they died, but we are not told of what, okay, other than the fact that they looked into the ark. So in the context of the pandemic, it is the text raises for me questions such as, is this one epidemic or 2 epidemics? Are they both? How are they both related to one another? Why did the author not give us a description of the symptoms, such as tumors or boils or sores, which kill the Philistines? Why is the same description not given of the Israelites? So this text, I think, offers several insights in terms of how the Israelites may have coped with this epidemic brought to them by the Philistines, and observation of Levitical law codes. The burning of the cart and the cows is perhaps part of the reason why the epidemic did not spread beyond the 70 men. And it is possible that the disease was brought by one of the Philistines accompanying the cart. Maybe he was asymptomatic, and therefore the Israelites did not know until after the virus spread and killed those 70 men. So within this text, you have some information about the divine role in the epidemic, but you also have mention of rituals and hints at measures taken to stop the spread of the virus. I think I'll stop here, and then we can let the others speak, and then I will continue as well with some other ideas. Yes.
Thanks, Monica, for opening up the scriptures. I might pass to Robyn now for some insights from the Christian New Testament.
Thanks, Peter. The first thing I want to say about the New Testament is we need to distinguish the way the text talks about disease and sickness in general, and then plagues as a kind of specific category. So we get plagues in something like the book of Revelation, which has had a bit of an airing during coronavirus times. I was Googling earlier and found some headlines for news articles saying, did Revelation predict coronavirus? The answer is no, spoiler alert. But in Revelation, we get these kind of sense of biblical plagues that Monica was talking about, and that is that they are divine punishment, they're directly from God, and they're sent to address or punish some form of sin on earth. And we should say that plagues in the Bible are not just sickness. There's plagues there that are hailstorms and turning water into blood and things that go beyond just physical sickness, although it includes that too. For me, theologically, I think the more helpful part of the Bible might actually be to look at what the Gospels say about disease and sickness. And of course, Jesus' ministry is marked throughout by being a healing ministry. And that healing encompasses both what is sometimes called sickness and what is often framed as exorcism, so the casting out of unclean spirits. So to give you one example, Mark's gospel starts with an exorcism, an unclean spirit being sent out of a man in the synagogue, and followed immediately by the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, from whom Jesus casts out a fever. And the language echoes each other in those two, that the casting out of a fever from the body is described in the same way as the casting out of an unclean spirit. I think what's striking for me is that in neither of those stories do we have any hint of a moral judgment, that the person being healed or cleansed is somehow to blame, is somehow sinful. In fact, in both cases, their own sort of agency is almost missing from the story. And that's partly because these stories are ultimately stories about Jesus and who he is. They're not sort of medical texts. There are other ancient medical texts, but the Gospels are not medical texts trying to give us a comprehensive sense of what sickness and disease is. Now, some of you might be thinking immediately of, there's a couple of passages that do loom large of Jesus asking, when he's asked to heal a blind man, who sinned, this man or his parents? So we get in the New Testament, I think, a significant shift from the kind of worldview Monica's describing, but we also have echoes of that. We have a Judaism that is shifting, and Jesus is part of a wider conversation here. And I think part of that shift is an apocalyptic worldview shift that sees sickness and disease as part of a broken world, or part of what one scholar calls a distortion of the divine. And so the presence of Jesus as a divine presence is to reorder that world and reestablish wholeness and healing. So that might be enough by way of intro, but there's some obviously theological themes there and interpretive traditions that stem from both of those parts of the New Testament.
Yeah, I can see we're going to need to come back to this concept of disorder and the concept of judgment as well could be big. Lyndal, tell us what did Luther have to say about plague?
Well, it's so interesting because I've worked on Luther for about 12 years, and yet I'd never really taken in the stuff about plague until now. And it has made me understand Luther in a very different way. And part of that, I was thinking about, well, what is it like for someone like Luther to experience plague, which is what happened in 1527, when Wittenberg, which is a tiny university town, it's probably 2,000-3,000 inhabitants, when it's struck by the plague. And this happens at a point in Luther's own life, which is really interesting, because earlier, just a few months before, he'd gone through what I would describe as something like a complete breakdown. He got married in 1525, and he'd done that at an extraordinary moment in German history, which is a whole other story in itself. But he's married a former nun. So that is a huge change in his own life. And you probably remember how what's key to Luther's spirituality is the Anfechtungen, or temptations, that he goes through. And at first, after his marriage, they disappear. But then in 1527, they come back with a real vengeance. And he talks about God having sent him to school, and he's unable to work, and he has a physical collapse. So then after that, a couple of months later, in August, he's then confronted with the plague. And I think how that's helped me think about his ministry differently is to think, well, this is someone who's been a monk, who's been married only 2 years, who has his own son, and who's now confronted by a very different pastoral relationship to the people in Wittenberg. So the academics all have to leave town, and the students leave town. The university moves to Jena, and Luther stays. He decides to stay in Wittenberg, and I think the whole experience is a way of him understanding his own relationship to his community very differently. And that's why I find him an extraordinary person to read about plague, because he's deeply marked by the experience he goes through. And during the time that he's ministering, the wife of the mayor dies in his arms. And his own chaplain, his wife is pregnant, she gives birth, it's a stillbirth, and then she dies. So Luther witnesses really agonizing deaths personally. And I think that just affects what he has to say about plague. And I find Luther as a theologian in terms of what he says about, and as a pastor, he says some wonderful things, and he also says some terrible things. And so I guess what I'm really interested to see coming out of the conversation is how one can pick up some of the things that people say about plague that I think are really helpful and that do stand the test of time. And then also think, well, how can we acknowledge the other ways that people have used plague? And I think with Luther in his early work, one of the things you do see is an application of it where it's about where he comes out with stuff that is really anti-Semitic, but we'll come back to that later.
Great, thank you, Lyndal. And Karen, would you like to give us a bit of an insight to, I think, Scottish preachers in the 17th century and their take on plague?
Thanks very much, Peter. Kia ora. Yes, I come at this from a slightly different point of view, perhaps. I'm actually a sort of historian of social and medical history, and as Peter says, particularly of responses to plague in my native Scotland. And so I, first of all, have been looking a lot at what governments in particular and physicians have thought and enacted when it comes to taking measures against plague. And so the first thing that's always struck me that it's largely accepted almost without question amongst physicians, magistrates and preachers alike that plague operates on two levels. So you have the supernatural or primary level, whereby God, an omnipotent God, dictates incidents of plague. But then it also operates on a secondary or temporal level, in which God, the vast majority of people agreed, worked through nature, effectively, to spread plague through miasma, polluted airborne vapors, and also through contagion, which was contact, although not necessarily direct. So it's had a different meaning from contagion today, but contact with sources of infection, be they people, animals, or inanimate objects like cloth. And so looking at these responses has led me to my current project, which is looking at Scotland's only printed plague sermon, which was preached probably late in 1644 by a preacher of some distinction, actually, because he was blind. And so he didn't have a parish of his own. Those two things are probably connected, but he was essentially an itinerant preacher around the Scottish capital of Edinburgh for several decades, and he was regarded in high renown by the few writers who commented on his sermons. And his sermon was published in July of 1645, a few months after it had been preached. And it's entitled "The Only Sure Preservative Against the Plague of Pestilence." And it's described in a sermon upon the 5th and 6th verses of the 91st Psalm. So Skeldy, Archibald Skeldy was the preacher's name. And he used Psalm 91, particularly verses 5 and 6, to talk about the plague which was then rife in Edinburgh. It ended up killing probably 20% of the city. It was Scotland's last outbreak and its worst, pretty widespread as far as we know. And I think what really struck me, coming to this from not a theological background, is that I think Skeldy really sought to temper the sort of association of epidemics, of plague, as simply as God's punishment, and he really sought to emphasize to his flock, to believers, the importance of providing them with spiritual comfort, essentially in the midst of this absolute chaos and disaster and devastation that they saw around them. And he really wanted to bring a more sort of optimistic message that ultimately, if one has faith in God, then one need not fear, because God will protect the true believer, and that's an important bit. Those who have true, unwavering faith, he will protect them from the pestilence, and that's directly drawing on verses 5 and 6 of Psalm 91. Surely he shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence. Thou shalt not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flieth by day, nor of the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor of the destruction that wasteth at noonday. And from this, Skeldy very much unpicks these particular lines and talks a lot about how plague can be likened to arrows, and we know that there's lots of sort of imagery that's a deep tradition of imagery of plague being regarded as God's arrows. And he talks about how it's the issue of it, people being more susceptible in noonday, more fearful in the night, those sorts of aspects. And his sermon really brings up a whole load of fascinating theological conundrums that we might get on to talking about, particularly with regard to the efficacy of temporal measures. If God is omnipotent and God has ordained plague, these episodes of epidemics to take place, and if one's eventual demise is being preordained by him, then what use are measures against plague? What's the point of flight? If, as Skeldy himself put it, I'm quoting from memory here, man cannot escape the hand of God, the avenging hand of God in any place where he can live. So these sorts of issues, which were also heavily debated in other plague sermons by Luther and by Andreas Osiander, Hooper, Beza, there was a whole load of preachers who really discussed these sorts of issues in a lot of depth. And Skeldy represents Scotland's contribution to this wide and really engaging set of specific literature in the early modern period. So I'll hand it back to Peter with that.
Thanks, Karen. I'm really struck by the richness of some of what we've heard, and particularly two things seem to strike me. One is the sort of politics of explanation. How do we account for plague and illness and where it comes from, and both supernatural and natural explanations. And I guess I'm conscious in that particular time of some of the conversation about climate change and environmental politics, which in an interesting way almost is too big for the human mind to handle. How do we understand this? But then how that politics of where did it come from and why is it here then becomes a force for understanding how do we respond to it. And so, Karen, I'm really taken with that notion. If it's from an avenging God, well, there's no point trying to get away from it. You have to stay and deal with it, or take the consequences, if you like, which is a pretty bleak message for our own time. So over to the group, Monica.
I wanted to add to this notion of the avenging God. I think even within this particular text, and also in the Exodus narratives concerning the plagues, God punishes. Yes, that is the avenging God is one image, but also God engages in this kind of activity to showcase His authority and power. Okay, without human mediation, so that God can take complete credit for the destruction of the Philistines or the destruction of the Egyptians, without any human agency involved in this process. which is also another disturbing notion attached to the way in which the divine functions.
Yeah, I want to add to that too. I think when we look at those passages like Exodus, and Revelation really picks up and reinterprets Exodus for a new time and place, there is an avenging God, but God is avenging injustice and oppression. In the case of the Egyptian slavery, it's framed as, well, either slavery or actually the intention of Pharaoh to just commit genocide and get rid of the Hebrews. And in Revelation, it's the Roman Empire. It's all that opposes God and is, wealthy and, maintaining power at the cost of human lives and what's perceived to be great injustice. So, yes, it's vengeful, but it's not vengeance for the sake of vengeance. I think what that second part gets missed in a lot of contemporary applications of that. When people talk about this as the control of God, to me that just doesn't apply to something like a current virus or the Spanish flu or some other pandemics, which are just so widespread. They don't have the focus that these biblical texts see. These are quite specific targets in the biblical, stories.
Lyndal.
I think that's just really, really interesting, and that helps me to understand what's going on with Luther. Mm-hmm. Luther does put it in a frame of God and the devil, but if you do that, the point that you made about it being God and not human agency, that means that what you then don't do is blame the Jews for poisoning the wells, which is a medieval myth that is around. And what Luther does not do is look for a scapegoat. And I think that's really, really important. And that's something that I think we can see happening now, as certainly in I think in a lot of the discussion around COVID, there is an attempt to blame someone, to say it's this act that caused it, and to look for a group which you then turn into a scapegoat. And Luther, there's a way in which, by seeing this as part of the human condition and putting it in this kind of framework, can actually get you away from blaming others. So Luther too has all of this stuff about it being God's punishment for sin. But I think there's another way of seeing that too, because in Luther's view, every human act always has a little bit of sin in it, just because of the way we fall short as humans. And once you see it that way, then plague becomes part of the human condition, and part of our relationship with God. And Luther says things like, well, if you can't put up with the plague, how are you going to cope with a really serious rod of chastisement like famine or war? And he doesn't want to do plague sermons. And so that's quite interesting in relation to the point Karen was making. It's interesting too that there aren't more plague sermons, although it is a genre that does that certainly does exist. But Luther doesn't want to do lots of plague sermons. But can I just pick up on the chosen people thing and how important that is in the Old Testament and the way God protects his people by using plague against others? When I was thinking about all of this, I went back to some of Luther's early work in 1513 to 15. This is way before the Reformation. And it's the only place in which he talks about Psalm 91. So I wanted to see, well, what does Luther say? I was really shocked, because the way Luther reads Psalm 91 and reads the pestilences is metaphorical. So he says, well, what is this pestilence? What are the arrows that fly in the day? What's the night pestilence? And he says, well, it's heresy. And what's the greatest heresy? Well, that's to deny Christ. So what he does is he flips a psalm, which is about the Jews being protected by God as the chosen people, and about God's mercy, and he flips it around to say the Jews are not the chosen people, and they are the heretics. And I think that's that's also a danger that can be there in the kinds of ways people talk about plague, because this need to find a scapegoat and to turn things against others, I think, is very deep.
I'd add to that, Lyndal, that I completely agree that this notion of scapegoating is continues to be very prevalent with COVID-19 and some of our global leaders, for example, who like to continue to refer to it as the China virus and so on. That there certainly is a big lesson that we as a global society can learn from that. And I'm really interested in Luther's interpretation, as you mentioned, of Psalm 91. I think that's really interesting. And one thing that Skeldy also brings out in his sermon, not about Psalm 91 particularly, but Hebrews 12, I think he references specifically. He talks about how God, he doesn't punish his faithful children, so that plague is not ought not to be seen as a punishment, but rather he's chastising them. So he's chastising them as a loving father would chastise his children, and so it's ultimately for believers' own good that they are being that they are having this plague sent on them, and so I think that's also intended to be a sort of a message of comfort, really, and of hope as well, that there is an end to this. There's a good end to why this is happening in people's midst. If I can just very quickly return to my other particular interest, which is, if you like, earthly measures against plague. This is one of the big problems that a lot of governments were concerned about, was some of the implications of plague theology, especially of flight theology, because it meant, of course, that if you have this notion of plague being of God, of an omnipotent God directing plague, and that therefore there's no point in implementing earthly measures, this really risks people not bothering to adhere to plague legislation. And this was a real problem for governments. And the English government, for example, instigated in their plague orders, which they issued, they actually specifically sort of condemned or outlawed individuals, preachers and others, who might seek to try and pretend that these measures were of no use. And in fact, in 1603, one particular preacher, Henoch Clapham, he was a notorious preacher who basically believed that plague measures were of no use. He was imprisoned for his beliefs because they were so dangerous. So these theological interpretations of God's omnipotence, of issues of predestination, of free will, and so on, have very practical consequences in terms of people not obeying plague measures. And I think that's a really important point to bring out as well, that as I'm sure everyone watching this is aware, but these debates were not just highfalutin debates going on circling in print amongst an elite of thinkers. They had practical consequences for people trying to combat plague on the ground, as it were. So I think that's an interesting aspect to give some thought to as well.
I wonder if I might pick up on that to turn the conversation a little towards how do we make things better, if you like. How do we in our own time respond to the pandemic around us? And I'm conscious of two things that I've been struck by, and so with my own historical training, I've been acutely aware of what's felt a little like a lack of historical consciousness in the present time, because particularly in the West, there's a generation of people who've grown up with what my grandmother would have called wonder drugs, and in the sense that the possibility of a pandemic that can affect the entire globe really just hasn't been on people's radar or their horizon. And therefore, the sorts of things we're talking about in terms of scriptural responses, the response of preachers and pastors, resonates now in a very different context, because I'm thinking back again to some of the points that particularly Karen and Lyndal have made. To talk about pestilence or plague in, say, the 15th, 16th, 17th century, well, it ain't so bad, compared to famine or war. And so I guess the theological context for me, Robyn, this might be one for you, I suppose, is around the idea of the apocalypse, of the end times of Revelation, and the sense of, if in a Christian theological context, that everything's going to be made perfect or made better or restored at the end time, then the search for kind of, we want to go back to the old normal, it isn't actually part of that eschatological, theological framework about where we're heading, because we're already on a journey there. And so part of the struggle of life in that sense is to live with death, is to live with illness and misfortune. And I think there's a whole kind of grace and works thread in this somewhere as well. But Robyn, why don't you have a go at this?
Oh, big question. I guess the first thing to say is we're seeing apocalyptic language and imagery being evoked currently, but an apocalypse is about an unveiling. So it's about a revealing of how the world really is, rather than something about predicting the future in specific kinds of ways. And what gets unveiled in the book of Revelation through these actions that are God's is the evil and injustice that is destroying God's people. So I do see some threads there with, I think we are as communities seeing an unveiling of things that, it's been convenient for those of us with education and a certain level of wealth and privilege to ignore, which is injustice, the lack of access to basic health care that huge amounts of people have, the living conditions. Here in Melbourne, we've seen some, exposing of those who live in public housing and just how, the difference of quality of life. So I think in that level we are seeing some apocalyptic kind of moments. But I want to circle back to the kind of the rhetoric I think Karen mentioned or Lyndal in terms of turning interpretation on its head. Part of what the author of Revelation does is he interprets these sort of terrible events precisely as evidence that God is doing something that the world will get better. And it's an interesting rhetorical move to say that the fact you're suffering this is precisely because God's doing something and there's going to be this cosmic shakeup before it gets better. For me, that raises sort of a different set of theological questions about that I think the text of Revelation might not be interested in, because that is more about what God is doing. But if we're seeing this kind of global shakeup and this unveiling of the fragility of particularly Western culture and, corporations and capitalism, what is being shaken up and revealed to us that we're going to have to do differently? What do we need to, rather than going back, what do we need to step into that's going to be a different kind of future? I think are some of the questions raised for me. I don't know if that really answered your question, Peter, but it was a big question.
Very big question.
We can come back to some of it. So I'm interested what Luther, the other thing is, what is the Christian response? The problem with an apocalyptic worldview is it renders humans incredibly passive if we say it's all up to God. So I'm interested that Luther, I'm interested in this historical perspective. My understanding, which is limited, is that there were Christians who did stay and did quite remarkable things in plague situations. And so what the sort of appropriate response is, I think is
I think what's interesting about Luther is that he steers pretty clear of apocalyptic language in relation to this, and I was really struck by that. And I think that then opens it up for him to do all those things that Karen was talking about. He does say you should socially distance. He says don't put yourself in, don't spread plague. Don't take risks, don't tempt God by running unnecessary risks of infection. but don't go. You have a duty to stay. And I think by grounding it in this world as part of the human condition, rather than focusing on the apocalyptic dimension, I think it does open up two issues that I'd really like to know what other people think about. And one is, I think it makes him think in quite a profound way about death, how you support people whose loved ones die, and how you support people who are facing death. And one of the most shocking things for me has been that many people have been left to die on their own without any loved ones with them and without any kind of emotional support. And the way he reminds us that we need help when we die. I just find something that I keep thinking about, the experience of death itself and how we can think about that and do something about that as a society. And that's why Luther understands he cannot leave Wittenberg, because that's his job. What is a pastor for if not to be there and face death and not pretty it up or just, yeah. And then I think the other thing that I find really helpful, and I'd love to know what you think about, is, and that's why I think it's so interesting that it happens after he's married. He talks about those who are angewachsen, who are grown into a community, and they are the ones who cannot leave, who have friends, who have children and family in a city. They cannot leave because of the debt that we owe to each other. And he talks about how we have to distribute the resources we have. We have to share. And he even says we each owe a debt to the other. And I think that mutual obligation is really helpful to think about.
That's hugely striking, Lyndal, because with border closures and, travel reduction and everything, watching in our own society, the relocalisation of community has been exceptional. And, at the moment in Melbourne, what's the best thing you can do with your 5 kilometre, distance? Go to the local shops and keep them open and buy a takeaway coffee, even though you can't drink it through a mask. But there's something very interesting happening about the re-emergence of the local and in a sense of commitment to place. And Monica, I wonder if you want to come in on this, because I'm struck by the opening examples that you presented us with. Here is an object that's being moved into the wrong place, if you like, and causing pestilence, but then is coming back. And this theme to me of which community and where is very striking. We just got you on mute, Monica.
What was interesting for me in that particular text is that alongside the burning and of the oxen or the cows and the cart, it didn't stop the epidemic from affecting the community there. And when those 70 men died, they passed it on to someone else in Israel. They passed the ark on to someone else. And the ark goes into seclusion or isolation for 20 years, we are told, and so, I don't have an answer to your question with regard to, the object, but the object here is, of course, is something that has to be revered, and when it is not revered, like the inhabitants at Shemesh, they looked into it, and therefore they had to be punished. Having said that, I think even though the origin of illness and disease is seen as to be Yahweh, there are multiple instances of what human beings can do to stop the spread of an illness or disease. So, for example, in Numbers chapter 12, Miriam is struck with some sort of skin ailment, but it is God who heals her when her brothers mediate on her behalf. But then, even though she has been healed, she still observes the 7 days of isolation, and the entire community waits, before they can proceed on the journey towards Canaan. So therefore, there is whether it is individual, even if it is an individual issue, there is a role that the community plays, and there is sufficient emphasis within the Hebrew Bible of the responsibility of the individual in order to stop the spread of a disease.
If I can pick up on your very last point there, in fact, Monica, this idea of the responsibility of the individual is a really fascinating and very prevalent one, I think, in flight theology, for example, because there were so many different permutations of different scenarios that you might posit when it came to flight. Ought one to stay, ought one to go? It brought in, ultimately, one's own personal conscience. It had to come back to one's own conscience and one's own particular situation. So things like their obligations, both public and private, were huge things to think about. And so some theologians advocated flight so long, but within certain with certain conditions. So things like if there were sufficient other magistrates or preachers left, then one could be permitted to flee. In fact, one scenario had it that actually it was your duty to flee, because if you were a sufficiently important magistrate, for example, then you had a duty to the Commonwealth to save yourself so that you could return when it was safe and engage, continue on in your very, very important public role. So there were so many different scenarios depending on a person's own life circumstances and obligations and so on, that a matter of flight theology really focused in on a person's individual conscience in deciding whether or not they ought to stay or they could stay. And also to pick up on something that you said, Robyn, and I think this is something interesting to think about today when we're faced with COVID. One thing that fascinates me is the way that epidemics were an epidemic was a call to reform. So rather than just being a punishment from God, it was, if you like, a wake-up call, and God saying, well, you ought to repent, so that you ought to appease me, so that I can forgive you, and not only bring the epidemic to an end, but also thereby create a sort of a better, more moral society for everybody, if you like. And I think, that perhaps this is our time to reform. I think this is on a global level, whether we see it as a call from God or a call from nature or just from our fellow citizens, if you like. This is a chance to reassess things like our healthcare structures, the environment. Something that fascinates me is that in the early modern period, believers had this whole theology gave believers a real sense of agency, that by repenting, by engaging in fasting, other acts of repentance to appease God, they could actually have a tangible part to play in bringing the epidemic to an end. And I think this was a really, really important aspect for people. And so if we think about our modern situation, just look at the way, for example, air pollution has been reduced in so many cities. A recent study said that it was up to 50% in some of the really major cities around the world. There's been a lot of studies done on that recently. And so things like, this is our chance when we as it were, put our collective global mind to it, we can cut pollution, we can affect climate change, and so these sorts of things are perhaps a sort of modern call to reform, in the way that in the early modern period, God called his believers to reform by sending an individual epidemic to get them to repent. So I quite like that connection between the past and the present.
Yeah, I agree. I think showing concern and compassion for others and for the earth, all of this, and exercising human agency has to be understood as an intentional collaboration with God in bringing back order that you had spoken about, Robyn. So it is, yes, God does things, but God also invites human beings to participate in the repairing and in the and in the healing and in the reconciling of the earth and humanity.
And I was struck, Carolyn and Lyndal, and in both the examples you've given, that there is this very careful balancing of the flight or the service to stay, the individual and the communal. And I guess I see that absent perhaps from some of the extreme examples we're seeing, particularly out of places like the USA with, there's been these notorious churches that have just refused to close their doors, for example. And, going to church without a mask becomes almost a test of faith. And unfortunately, people have died as a result of some of those communities continuing as usual. And for me, what's missing in that kind of response is that concern for community and that sense that your actions impact others. And, even what you were saying, Lyndal, there is a sense of Luther being aware of spatial distancing and yet still serving. Is there more we can learn from those kind of, where's that balance in some of these sort of, going back a few centuries between the service, but not martyrdom, I guess, not useless martyrdom. That there's good martyrdom, there's being prepared to die for something you firmly believe, and then there's just, to put it bluntly, stupidity.
Luther's great on that, and he's wonderful at ridiculing people who tempt God by deliberately putting themselves in the path of plague. But I think what you've also put your finger on, though, is what kind of ministry can be provided in times like this, and what can be done for people who have to die on their own. And I don't know the answer to that. But I think it's something that we really have to think about. And I think as a society, we do not have the ability to talk about death in the way that people in the early modern period did, because it was so much more a part of people's experience. And I think that's where we can learn a lot from Luther. It's when he stops being a monk, when his whole life is lived in the community, and that is the pastoral issue. That's when he stops seeing plague in metaphorical terms, although he doesn't give that up, unfortunately, but he thinks about it practically and thinks, well, what is the ministry that has to be given? What does it mean to share burdens in a community? How can we work together?
Colleagues, we are out of time for this conversation. I am really struck by some of the positive insights for thinking back to the ancient and more recent worlds in terms of what does it mean to die? What does it mean to care for each other? And some of the richness and comfort that this historical long-term perspective can bring. And I guess I'm struck by a comment a friend of mine in the religious life made to me, which picks up on the concepts of disorder, reorder, things being in their right place, speaking to you about the rule of life in a monastic context and how it's about balance and rebalancing. And I've been struck more and more, I think, picking up on Lyndal's question, how do we face death in a modern, particularly Western society, and how do we care for those who are dying, very often alone, and then attending to those things that have been happening all along. People have always died alone, but we haven't noticed. And that part of that rebalancing act that perhaps we're called to is to attend to these things in the future and reprioritise them. How do we care for the dying? How do we care for the dead, both ritually and personally? And how do we reprioritise these issues while also working for the healing of the whole world, whether you're a person of faith or not? So we have many more conversations to have, many more things to learn, and many more duties, I think, which we'll be called to attend to as we live through and survive and eventually once more flourish in the wake of this pandemic. But for now, I'd like to express my profound thanks to Monica, Robyn, Karen and Lyndal for their time in this conversation, and wish you all the best.